December 16, 1944, before dawn. The Ardennes forest sleeps under a white shroud. Snow drifts silently across abandoned roads, cloaking the wreckage of autumn's retreat. The trees stand tall and ghost-like, black silhouettes against the pale morning. Breath freezes mid-air. The world is hushed, brittle, still. American sentries huddle in foxholes near the Belgian border, men of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. They whisper about home, about Christmas coming soon. Somewhere a mess tin clinks. Then silence again. Beyond the tree line, the earth trembles. Engines growl in the dark, hundreds of them. German tanks, half-tracks, and trucks idle beneath camouflage nets. Crews smoke in silence, waiting for the order. Their commander, under orders from a delusional Führer, is about to wager the last of Germany's strength on one final blow. At exactly 05:30, the forest erupts. 1,000 guns unleash their fury, a wall of thunder rolling through the valleys. The Ardennes, once dismissed as impassable, becomes the gateway to the last great gamble of the Reich. By the closing months of 1944, the war in Europe appeared nearly decided. After the Allied landings in Normandy that June, the German army had been driven from France in a relentless months-long retreat. Paris was liberated in August. Brussels and Antwerp soon followed. The Western Allies, now confident, battle-hardened, and logistically superior, believed victory was a matter of time. To many Allied commanders, the German army seemed broken. Its once fearsome panzer divisions were shadows of their former strength, its Luftwaffe barely a threat in the skies. Supply lines were fractured, and the Reich itself was under daily bombardment. The public mood in London and Washington was triumphant. The end was near. Yet beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler refused to concede defeat. He saw weakness not in Germany but in the Allies. Their front line, stretching hundreds of miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea, was thin, overextended, and held largely by inexperienced or exhausted units rotating for rest. Hitler was convinced that a sudden, massive counterattack could shatter it entirely. His idea was as bold as it was desperate. Launch a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, drive west to seize Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. By cutting off the British in the north and forcing the Americans to negotiate separately, he hoped to fracture the alliance and buy time for a negotiated peace. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. To the German generals, the name carried a cruel irony. This would not be a defensive stand, but a reckless thrust through terrain that history had long deemed unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. The Ardennes had been the scene of battle before, most notably in 1940, when German panzers had surged through its narrow roads to outflank the Maginot Line and crush France in 6 weeks. But by late 1944, that same region had transformed into a natural fortress, steep ridges, dense forests, and roads that twisted like veins through frozen valleys. The Allies considered it a quiet sector, so quiet that some American units called it the Ghost Front. Hitler's decision was shaped by obsession and delusion in equal measure. He believed that the West lacked the stomach for more bloodshed, that a single devastating blow could unravel the fragile Allied coalition. His generals, including Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Model, warned him of reality: fuel shortages, dwindling manpower, and Allied air superiority. But Hitler silenced dissent. His order was final. In October and November 1944, German industry redirected its last reserves. Panzers were overhauled in secret. Ammunition trains moved by night. Entire divisions disappeared from other fronts under the cover of radio silence. Every movement was cloaked in deception. Even the German people were kept in ignorance. By early December, nearly 400,000 men and 1,500 tanks had been assembled in the Eifel region. Among them were elite units, SS Panzer divisions, Volksgrenadiers, paratroopers, and hastily trained replacements, many barely 18. They were told they were defending Germany. Only days before the assault were they informed of their true mission: to strike west, cross the Meuse River, and take Antwerp within days. Across the lines, the Americans remained unaware. Winter weather grounded reconnaissance flights and intercepted radio traffic was sparse. The front in the Ardennes was held by divisions that had seen little combat, sent there precisely because it was considered safe. Command posts were relaxed, patrols light. Officers planned for Christmas leave. But in Berlin, maps were drawn and red arrows slashed westward. For Hitler, the Ardennes was more than strategy. It was redemption. A chance to erase humiliation, to prove that the German army could still seize initiative even at the edge of collapse. And as December deepened, the stage was set. In the icy stillness of the forest, tanks stood hidden under snow-laden branches, their engines warming quietly. In the villages of the Eifel, soldiers were handed chocolate rations and orders to move before dawn. The world believed Germany could no longer attack. They were wrong. The first week of December 1944 brought a cold that bit deep into the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Snow fell day after day, burying roads and muffling sound. It was the perfect camouflage and the perfect cover. Under that wintry silence, the Wehrmacht was gathering for its last great gamble. Convoys rolled by night, headlights blacked out, drivers guided by white tapes laid along forest paths. Villagers who peeked from shuttered windows saw shadows, endless columns of men in armor disappearing into the trees. They were forbidden to speak under penalty of death. Even local commanders often didn't know the full scale of what was coming. The force massing for the offensive was immense. 3 armies: the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger. Their task: punch through the thin American line, seize key road junctions, and reach the River Meuse before the Allies could respond. The main weight would fall on the 6th SS Panzer, including Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the ambitious and ruthless Joachim Peiper. He commanded some of the most powerful tanks of the war, King Tigers with armor too thick for most Allied guns. But they had a fatal weakness: fuel. Germany's reserves were nearly gone. The entire offensive was a race against exhaustion. Meanwhile, the Allied commanders saw no reason for alarm. In their intelligence briefings, the German army was described as on the defensive everywhere. The ultra-code breakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted almost nothing, suggesting a major attack. The Allies' own successes had blinded them. General Eisenhower's staff believed Germany was incapable of coordinating large-scale movement, especially under constant bombing. In forward American positions, complacency mixed with fatigue. The 99th Infantry Division, young and untested, manned a 22-mile stretch near the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. The 106th Division, green and thinly spread, held the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. Scattered along the southern sector were battle-weary veterans of the 28th Division, recovering from the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest battles of the year. They expected rest, not renewal of war. Then came the weather, the kind only soldiers remember forever. Blizzards swept across the front. Allied planes, the shield of the ground forces, were grounded for days. The sky turned gray and heavy, a natural curtain drawn across the battlefield. It was exactly what Hitler had prayed for. Behind German lines on December 15th, final briefings were held in freezing bunkers. Maps were unfolded on wooden tables. Commanders marked objectives in thick pencil: Bastogne, Saint-Vith, Houffalize, Dinant. They were to cross the Aar River at dawn, overwhelm the thin American line, and rush for the Meuse. Speed was everything. Delay meant death. Orders were strict: advance west, ignore resistance, seize fuel wherever possible. Even American fuel dumps were targets of opportunity. The plan left no margin for error, no reserve. Every division, every tank, every liter of gasoline was committed to the first blow. In the early hours of December 16th, American artillerymen along the front noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. No night patrols, no sounds of sporadic gunfire, just the wind and the faint hum of distant engines. At 05:30, the darkness split open. German guns, over 1,600 artillery pieces, unleashed a barrage across an 80-mile front. Shells howled through the snow-choked air, tearing into sleeping camps and command posts. Telephone lines were cut, bridges destroyed, confusion immediate. Within minutes, American frontline units were engulfed. As dawn broke, German tanks rolled out of the mist, black crosses stark against the snow. American soldiers, dazed and scattered, stumbled into battle with no warning, no coordination, and no idea of the scale of what was unfolding. The Ardennes, long thought impassable, was now a corridor of fire and steel. And within hours, the Allies realized this was no local counterattack. It was an invasion. The human angle men in the snow. For the American infantrymen along the Ardennes line, the attack felt unreal. The previous evening had been quiet, A few patrols, a few cigarettes shared in the cold. By dawn, the world had turned into chaos. At the front near Lanzerath Ridge, a small intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 99th Division, just 18 men strong, faced the leading edge of the German advance. Outnumbered more than 80 to 1, they held their ground for nearly an entire day, slowing the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. Their commander, Lieutenant Lyle Buck, later recalled watching waves of German infantry moving through the trees, thinking, "They just kept coming, an ocean of gray." Across the front, similar scenes unfolded. Men fought from foxholes half filled with snow and blood. Artillery crashed through the forests, splintering trees into spears. Medics wrapped bandages with trembling hands in the freezing air. The wounded froze where they fell, and the dead disappeared beneath drifts by nightfall. Many soldiers never saw their officers again. Units were cut off, surrounded, or overrun within hours. Radios went silent. The front dissolved into pockets of resistance. Small groups of men clinging to crossroads, barns, or burned-out villages. The terrain itself was the enemy. Snow waist-deep, visibility near zero, temperatures plunging below freezing. For the Germans, morale surged. After months of retreat, they were advancing again. Civilians greeted them with fear and confusion. Some believed the war might yet be turned. But others, veterans who had survived the Eastern Front, recognized the cost. They saw the fuel trucks running half-empty, the overstrained supply lines, and the impossible timetable. Among them was Joachim Peiper, whose armored spearhead spearheaded the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance. His men moved fast, brutal, efficient, seizing bridges, overrunning American outposts. But they were also ruthless. In the town of Malmedy, captured American prisoners were executed in the snow. A war crime that would haunt the offensive's legacy. For the soldiers on both sides, the Ardennes was no longer a place. It was a frozen nightmare, where courage meant surviving the next hour and mercy froze with the ground. The tactical angle, the gamble of the Ardennes. The German plan was built on speed, shock, and confusion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominally in command of the operation, knew the risks. Hitler's plan was ambitious to the point of delusion. Capturing Antwerp in a week required perfect weather, intact bridges, and a crumbling Allied response. Yet for all its flaws, Wacht am Rhein was tactically brilliant on paper. The offensive relied on narrow corridors, a series of parallel roads cutting through dense forest. Each German army had a designated path, converging toward the Meuse. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer would attack in the north through Losheim and Billingen, Manteufel's 5th Panzer through the center toward Bastogne, and Brandenberger's 7th Army would guard the southern flank, preventing Allied reinforcements. At the heart of this plan was surprise. The Allies had not reinforced the Ardennes, believing its hills and woods unsuitable for armor. Hitler's generals exploited that belief, turning terrain into camouflage. Columns of tanks and half-tracks snaked through the valleys, their movements hidden by snow and fog. Communications were minimal. Even German radio traffic was suppressed to maintain secrecy. But the forest that offered concealment also created a trap. Each road became a bottleneck. When American resistance stiffened, as it did at St. Vith and Bastogne, entire divisions were forced to halt, their convoys stretching for miles. Fuel shortages worsened by the hour. Peiper's tanks, though powerful, consumed thousands of liters daily. Without captured fuel, they would soon be immobile iron coffins. The Americans, though initially scattered, adapted quickly. Small units fought delaying actions at crossroads, ambushing convoys, destroying bridges. Engineers blew culverts and mined choke points. In places like Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions dug in and refused to yield. Their defense stalled the northern thrust of the 6th SS Panzer, denying Hitler's best divisions the roads they desperately needed. On maps in Berlin, red arrows still pointed confidently toward the Meuse. On the ground, those arrows collided with mud, snow, and human will. The tactical brilliance of surprise was already bleeding away. The battle was shifting, from a lightning strike to a grinding struggle for survival. And at its center stood one critical point, the crossroads town of Bastogne. The technological angle tightens in the snow. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a clash of men. It was a duel of machines. In those frozen forests, technology became both weapon and burden. The Germans fielded their most formidable tanks with the Tiger II, or King Tiger, a 70-ton fortress of steel. Its 80mm gun could destroy an American Sherman tank at over a mile. Crews trusted its armor like a second skin. They called it Der Königstiger, the king of beasts, but the terrain of the Ardennes was no hunting ground for such giants. The narrow, icy roads, deep snow, and forest paths crippled maneuverability. Some tanks bogged down or broke their tracks within hours of entering combat. The Americans, by contrast, relied on the M4 Sherman, lighter, faster, and easier to repair. In a direct duel, a Sherman stood little chance against a Tiger. But Shermans traveled in numbers, supported by nimble supply chains and adaptable crews. Their mechanical simplicity became an advantage. When one burned, another was already rolling forward. Fuel, not firepower, became the decisive currency. German tanks often halted not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. Units abandoned vehicles that could not be refueled. Crews siphoned petrol from civilian cars, from captured Allied dumps, even from wrecked trucks. The offensive's grand tempo slowed into a crawl. The forest, once a cloak for surprise, turned into a trap for the machines that depended on movement. For the Allies, technology's true savior came from above, though it would take days for the skies to clear. As fog and snow finally lifted in late December, P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons roared overhead, strafing columns, torching fuel convoys, and ripping open what remained of Germany's momentum. The same weather that had once favored the attackers now became their executioner. The leadership angle minds of the offensive in Berlin, Adolf Hitler commanded the battle not from maps but from obsession. He refused to allow withdrawals, refused to consider setbacks, and demanded reports that confirmed his fantasies. To him, the offensive was not merely a military operation. It was a statement of will, a declaration that Germany would not die quietly. His senior commanders, however, saw the chasm between vision and reality. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, a veteran of 2 wars, argued that Germany's only hope was a limited counterattack to delay the Allies, not to drive to the sea. Walther Model, commander of Army Group B, called the plan madness wrapped in faith. Even Hasso von Manteuffel, who led the 5th Panzer Army with brilliance and professionalism, privately knew the offensive could not achieve its full aim. Yet all obeyed, because disobedience meant ruin. On the Allied side, leadership faced its own test. General Eisenhower, caught by surprise, reacted with calm resolve. He recognized the attack for what it was, Germany's last desperate throw. His order was simple: hold the shoulders, contain the Bulge, and counterattack when the skies clear. Among his subordinates, none acted with greater urgency than General George S. Patton. Commanding the U.S. Third Army in Lorraine, Patton was already preparing for movement. His staff had quietly drawn contingency plans weeks before, including one for a sudden pivot north toward Belgium. When Eisenhower asked how soon he could relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, Patton's reply was immediate: "I can attack in 48 hours." In war, timing is everything, and leadership turns maps into action. Hitler's command paralyzed his army. Eisenhower's trust in his generals liberated theirs. The moral angle, faith, desperation, and the human cost. The Ardennes offensive was not just fought with bullets and tanks, it was fought with belief. To the Germans, it was a final crusade, a defiant strike to prove that the Reich still had strength. To the Americans, it became a test of endurance, courage, and unity. In snow-choked foxholes, chaplains prayed beside machine guns. Soldiers clutched letters from home, their ink smudged by melting frost. Fear was constant, but so was stubbornness. A private from the 101st Airborne later recalled, "We weren't fighting for strategy or orders. We were fighting to live to see another sunrise." For many Germans, the moral weight was heavier still. Some fought with fanatic loyalty, others simply because turning back meant execution. The SS, hardened by ideology, executed prisoners and civilians with cold efficiency. Yet even among them, exhaustion was visible. Eyes hollow, boots torn, faith faltering. The massacre at Malmedy, where over 80 unarmed American prisoners were murdered by Piper's men, became a rallying cry for vengeance. Word spread quickly through the ranks. No prisoners. The battle, already brutal, turned merciless. But even amid such darkness, there were moments of defiance that rekindled faith. Most famously, in the small Belgian town soon to become immortal, Bastogne. As snow thickened and the German ring closed around it, a pocket of American paratroopers refused to surrender. Their stand, hopeless on paper, heroic in spirit, would become the turning point of the battle and of the war's final winter. By December 19, 1944, the German offensive had driven a deep wedge into the Allied line, a bulge that would give the battle its name. American divisions had fallen back in confusion, and key crossroads were now in danger of encirclement. At the center of this chaos lay Bastogne, a small Belgian town of narrow streets and stone houses, unremarkable in peace, but vital in war. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of men, armor, and supplies across the southern Ardennes. The German 5th Panzer Army knew it. So did the U.S. commanders racing to defend it. In the days before Christmas, the 101st Airborne Division, battle-hardened from Normandy and Holland, arrived by truck and foot, exhausted, short of winter gear, and barely supplied with ammunition. Alongside them came elements of the 10th Armored Division and local stragglers from shattered units. Together they formed a thin ring around Bastogne, less than 12,000 men facing more than 45,000 Germans. The siege began almost immediately. German artillery shelled the town relentlessly. Villages on the outskirts, Noville, Foy, and Marvy, were reduced to rubble. Paratroopers fought house to house, trading ground for time. In the forests beyond, fog and snow turned the world gray and soundless, broken only by the thump of mortars and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The defenders had no winter coats, no resupply routes, and almost no medical support. Their wounded lay in basements and barns, tended by overworked medics using torn uniforms for bandages. Food ran low. Morphine ran out. Still they held. When German envoys approached under a white flag on December 22nd, demanding surrender, the acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a one-word reply that would echo through history: nuts. The message, though simple, embodied more than defiance. It captured the spirit of the entire Allied front. Cut off, surrounded, and freezing, the men of Bastogne refused to yield. Their stubborn defense delayed the German timetable, forcing fuel convoys to detour and armored spearheads to stall in the snow. Beyond the siege and Allied headquarters at Verdun, the situation was dire but not panicked. Eisenhower recognized Bastogne as the pivot of the entire battle. Lose it and the Germans might reach the Meuse. Hold it and their advance would bleed to death. Help was coming, but the weather still ruled the war. For 6 days, heavy clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Paratroopers in Bastogne watched the sky every morning, praying for sunlight. Finally, on December 23rd, the clouds began to thin. First came a hum, then a roar. From the south, the sky filled with C-47 transport planes, and over 250 of them. They dropped crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies by parachute. Soldiers cheered as the chutes blossomed like white flowers against the blue. For many, it was the first time they had smiled in days. Soon after, the roar changed, deeper, faster, lethal. P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons swept in low, attacking German columns and artillery positions with rockets and bombs. Fuel convoys exploded in chains of fire. Tanks that had advanced boldly under the fog now scrambled for cover beneath the same sky they once prayed would stay gray. The turning of the weather turned the battle. German lines began to falter. Their attacks on Bastogne grew weaker, less coordinated. Some divisions ran out of fuel altogether. Others, trapped in the maze of forest roads, became easy targets for Allied airstrikes. But for the defenders inside Bastogne, the fight was far from over. Every night brought more shelling, more probing attacks. Every morning brought new names to the casualty lists. Still the circle held, defiant, unbroken, waiting for the thunder of engines that would announce salvation from the south. And that thunder was coming, led by a man who refused to believe in the word impossible. His name was George S. Patton. General George S. Patton was already moving before most realized the scale of the crisis. When the German offensive erupted, his Third Army had been driving east toward the Saar. Within 48 hours, he pivoted 90 degrees north, an audacious maneuver through ice-clogged roads and chaos. 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, swung toward Belgium in a massive, coordinated march. It was an operation of impossible speed. More than 100,000 men and 400 tanks moved through sleet and snow, guided by MPs waving flashlights in blizzards, engineers clearing wrecks, and chaplains praying beside fuel trucks. Every bridge crossed, every mile gained was fought not just against the enemy, but against winter itself. Patton drove his men like no one else could, but they followed him willingly. They knew the stakes. Bastogne was surrounded. The men inside were running out of time. If the Germans broke through to the Meuse before Patton arrived, the entire Allied front could collapse. By December 24th, German armor had encircled the town completely. Columns of King Tigers moved in from the northeast, while infantry pressed from the south. Artillery turned the center of Bastogne into a wasteland of splintered beams and frozen rubble. Yet the defenders refused to crack. "Hold fast," came the message from Allied High Command. "Relief is on the way." Christmas Day in Bastogne was a scene of defiance. In church cellars, soldiers sang carols among the wounded. Outside, shells burst among shattered buildings. Chaplains read the Nativity by candlelight as the ground trembled with gunfire. For both sides, the irony was unbearable. A holy day turned into hell. Then, on December 26th, the distant growl of engines rose from the south. At the village of Ardennes, tanks of the U.S. 4th Armored Division smashed through German lines. The lead Sherman, commanded by Sergeant John Ballantyne, burst into Bastogne's southern perimeter at 1650 hours. Exhausted paratroopers greeted them with disbelief and joy. One shouted, "You're late!" The relief of Bastogne was not a single charge, but the culmination of endurance. Patton's advance had been slowed by blizzards, mines, and stubborn resistance, but his timing was perfect. The German drive had already begun to lose cohesion. Fuel shortages crippled movement, and the once fearsome momentum of the panzers had stalled in the snow. To the north, Joachim Peiper's armored spearhead was trapped near L'Église. With fuel gone and encirclement tightening, Peiper abandoned his tanks and led his men on foot through the woods to escape. The wrecks of King Tigers littered the hills, hulking symbols of wasted power. By December 27th, the German advance had reached its limit. The panzers never crossed the Meuse. Instead, they faced relentless counterattacks from the north and south. Allied air power now ruled the skies, cutting off supply lines, annihilating convoys, and isolating entire divisions. In Berlin, Hitler raged at reports of failure. He demanded counterattacks that could no longer be mounted, ordered units that no longer existed, and promised reinforcements that would never arrive. His generals, weary and hollow-eyed, knew the truth. The Ardennes offensive, the last roll of the dice, was over. The bulge on the map, which had once reached deep into Belgium, was shrinking by the day. Villages retaken by the Americans revealed burned armor, dead horses, and frozen soldiers still at their guns. The roads were lined with the twisted skeletons of trucks and tanks, their engines locked solid by frost. By early January 1945, the counteroffensive had become a rout. The German armies withdrew toward the Rhine, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead and a dream that had died with them. For the Americans, the victory came at a terrible price and over 80,000 casualties. Yet amid exhaustion and grief, there was a sense of grim satisfaction. The line had held. The winter had been survived. And with it, the Reich's final hope of reversing the war was gone. The Ardennes had begun as Hitler's boldest gamble. It ended as his most costly failure, crushed under the same snow that once promised him cover. And as the last German columns retreated eastward, the world began to grasp that the war in Europe was entering its final act. When the guns finally fell silent over the Ardennes, the snow no longer seemed white. It was gray, scarred, and soaked with oil and blood. Burned-out tanks jutted from ditches like frozen beasts. Dead men, German and American alike, lay stiff in their foxholes, half buried beneath drifting snow. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. The Ardennes, once a quiet forest, had become a cemetery stretched across two nations. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would come to be known, had lasted from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, 40 brutal days that marked the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. The statistics were staggering. The U.S. Army suffered over 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead, 4,700 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. German losses were even heavier. 100,000 men, 800 tanks and assault guns, and virtually all of their remaining reserves in the West. But numbers alone could not capture the devastation. Entire villages had been erased. Roads were littered with the wrecks of supply trucks and the twisted frames of panzers. Civilians wandered among the ruins of their homes, pushing carts piled with blankets and bread. The forests themselves were shredded, trees sheared by shrapnel, fields cratered by shells. American medics described frozen corpses stacked beside aid stations, their faces dusted with frost. German prisoners, starving and exhausted, shuffled past them. Boys of 16 and men of 60, pulled from the Volkssturm and Waffen-SS alike. Many wept when given food. Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley toured the wreckage in early January. They spoke quietly among themselves, not in triumph but in disbelief at the scale of the fight. This was Hitler's last gamble, Bradley said, and he lost it all. For Germany, the consequences were irreversible. The offensive had consumed the last strategic reserves of the Wehrmacht. Fuel that might have sustained the defense of the Reich was gone. Thousands of irreplaceable tanks and vehicles lay abandoned in the snow, and with the loss of veteran officers, men who could not be replaced, the German army's command structure began to fracture beyond repair. In the east, the Red Army was preparing to launch its own winter offensive. Hitler's attempt to strike in the west had not delayed them. It had doomed him faster. By diverting his best divisions and precious fuel to the Ardennes, he had left the Eastern Front dangerously thin. When the Soviets attacked on January 12, 1945, their advance was unstoppable. The psychological toll within Germany was just as severe. For months, propaganda had promised victory, that new wonder weapons and surprise offensives would turn the tide. But after the failure in the Ardennes, even the most loyal citizens began to see the truth. Cities burned nightly under Allied bombers. Refugees filled the roads. The war that had once brought triumph now brought only hunger and ruin. For the Allies, Bastogne and the Bulge became symbols of resilience. The story of nuts. Brigadier General McAuliffe's one-word reply to the German surrender demand spread across every front. It embodied the stubborn defiance of soldiers who refused to yield, even when surrounded and freezing. But behind the pride was grief. Thousands of families received telegrams in January, short impersonal notices that a son or husband was missing or killed in action. Many of those bodies would never be recovered from the Ardennes snow. Still, amid the ruin, something had shifted. The victory in the Bulge gave the Allies renewed confidence. They had faced the best that Germany could still muster, and had prevailed. From this point onward, the war's momentum was irreversible. The Ardennes had drained Germany of its final strength. And as the survivors trudged east through snow and mud, they knew the road ahead led straight into the heart of the Reich itself. In the weeks following the Battle of the Bulge, Europe began to thaw, not with warmth but with the cold certainty of Germany's defeat. The Allied army stood bloodied but unbroken, staring east toward the Rhine. The Bulge that had once threatened to split them apart had been flattened. For the Germans, recovery was impossible. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The 6th Panzer Army, once the pride of Hitler's armored forces, limped back to Germany with fewer than half its tanks. The 5th Panzer Army left behind so many vehicles that Allied engineers used them to repair roads. Supply depots were empty, fuel stockpiles gone. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, could no longer protect retreating troops from the endless waves of Allied fighter bombers that prowled the skies. Even more devastating than the material losses was the blow to German morale. In propaganda broadcasts, Goebbels had promised that the Ardennes offensive would bring the Allies to the negotiating table. Instead, the offensive had exposed the hollowness of those lies. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements grew bolder, sensing that the Nazi Empire was finally cracking. In Berlin, the atmosphere turned feverish. Hitler blamed his generals, Rundstedt, Model, even Sepp Dietrich, for cowardice and disobedience. But the truth was simpler. The Ardennes had been built on fantasy. The plan had relied on secrecy, weather, and an enemy's paralysis that never came. It demanded resources Germany no longer had, and it underestimated the resilience of Allied logistics and air power, the same forces that had carried the war from Normandy to the borders of the Reich. By February 1945, Allied strategy shifted decisively. The lesson of the Bulge was clear. No negotiated peace would ever emerge from Berlin. Only unconditional surrender. Eisenhower ordered a relentless drive toward the Rhine. British, Canadian, and American forces began to close the pincers from the west, while the Soviet armies thundered in from the east. Germany was caught in a tightening vice. one that would soon crush its military, its cities, and its illusions. For the soldiers who survived the Ardennes, the memory of that winter remained indelible. Men spoke of the eerie quiet after battle, the forest littered with blackened wrecks, the silence broken only by crows. Many could not shake the feeling that something had ended there, not just a campaign but an era. In the U.S. ranks, the victory forged new legends. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne became symbols of American resolve. Patton's Third Army, once criticized for recklessness, was now hailed as the decisive force that broke the siege. Commanders like Bradley and Hodges emerged from the chaos with hard-won respect. Yet beneath the pride there was exhaustion. The winter of 1944-45 had tested the Western Allies more than any other moment since D-Day. It was a reminder that even in the war's final months, the enemy was capable of ferocity and cunning. As January turned to February, Allied engineers cleared the last of the snow-clogged roads. Columns of trucks, ambulances, and tanks rolled eastward, toward the Rhine, toward the heart of Germany. The names of small Ardennes towns, Bastogne, Saint-Vith, La Roche-Uffalize, would fade from maps but not from memory. And in those frozen woods where once the German army had believed the terrain impassable, the evidence of its downfall lay everywhere. Burned tanks, shattered helmets, the remnants of a dream that had frozen and died in the snow. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last shadow, the final reach of a dying empire. When it failed, the path to Berlin opened. From that moment onward, the end of the Third Reich was not a question of if, only when. The Ardennes stand silent again. Decades have passed since that winter, yet the forest still bears its scars. Faint craters beneath the moss, rusted shell fragments buried in the soil, the faint outlines of foxholes swallowed by time. In spring, wildflowers bloom where men once fell. Nature has reclaimed the battlefield, but it has not forgotten. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a clash of armies. It was the test of endurance, of human will pressed to the edge of despair. The Germans called it Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. The Americans called it simply the Bulge. But for those who fought there, it was the moment when the war's final truth became clear, that no amount of desperation could overcome exhaustion, and no last gamble could reverse the tide of history. In a sense, the Ardennes revealed both the brilliance and the blindness of war. Hitler's audacity, once a source of terror across Europe, had curdled into delusion. His commanders followed orders they knew were doomed, sacrificing what remained of an empire for a dream already dead. Across the lines, young American and German soldiers alike faced the same freezing winds, the same fear, the same question of why. When historians later called it Hitler's last gamble, they were not wrong. But it was also something deeper. The moment when the war's final curtain began to fall. From the white woods of Belgium to the ruins of Berlin, the path was now irreversible, and yet amid the destruction, the Ardennes offered one lasting testament, that courage when tested by chaos can endure. In every foxhole that held, in every convoy that reached Bastogne, in every medic who carried the wounded through snow and shell fire, humanity revealed a strength even greater than strategy. The Ardennes was not impassable after all, neither for tanks nor for men. It became the passage through which the world crossed from darkness into the approaching dawn, the dawn of victory and of peace painfully earned.